Welcome, everybody, to Constellations Conversations with me, Robert Rowland Smith, and my partner in crime, Nicola Dunn. Hello, Nicola.
Hello, Robert. Good to see you.
So, today we are going to look at the topic of purpose as it relates to constellations. I'm going to say a few things to get us going, Nicola, and then obviously you'll join in and add and improve and amend and so on and so forth. Now, why are we talking about purpose at all? I think partly because it's in the zeitgeist. The word purpose comes up a lot. Certainly, I think in the world of business, increasingly, and we hear a lot about purpose-led organizations, which seems to be something to do with sustainability. One hears the phrase purpose beyond profit quite a lot these days. So the idea of the purpose-led organization and the B Corp and so on seems to be more and more in vogue these days. So there's that. There's a connection, I suppose, in organizational work between purpose and values in organizations. We know what do you stand for beyond turning a profit, and to that extent, purpose is a kind of widely mentioned theme. It's also pretty common, I think we've both had experience of this in personal or family constellations too, when an issue holder will open by saying they've lost their sense of purpose or they don't know what their purpose is in life. And before we came on air, so to speak, I had remembered and shared with you the fact that I've had a few women returning to work after having children, wondering what their purpose is. Is it still the same as before, as having children? Is their purpose to be a mother? Is it to do something else? Is it to combine the two? And so on. But I've also just kind of reminded myself, I suppose, of a deeper aspect of purpose, which I'll go into. And I think this is probably a bastardization of the work of Hellinger, or at least my defective memory producing a theory that probably isn't his and maybe is a sort of a mishmash of his and mine and something else. But the theory is this, which is that human beings don't need a purpose. And this idea goes back actually to Aristotle. I'm very interested in philosophy, Nicola. And Aristotle says that what marks out human beings from other kinds of animal is that their purpose is simply to be. They contain their purpose within themselves. And he has the very kind of, well, a Greek word for it, entelechy. So that means the telos, which is the Greek word for a purpose or an end, is contained within us. It's entelechistic. So human beings have their purpose within themselves. It's just enough simply to be. And I think the Hellinger version of that, not that he refers to Aristotle, is that actually in a family, the only purpose we have is to assist with the flow of love, or at least not to block it. So our purpose as human beings is to live our lives and allow the love to flow, basically. So we don't even necessarily need a purpose beyond ourselves, like the classic statements of purpose would be things like, I want to make a difference in the world, I want to help others, I want to leave a legacy. Those would be ways in which people begin to articulate their sense of purpose in the world. But there is that. Yes, I guess that's slightly more philosophical way of thinking about it, whether human beings actually need a purpose at all, whether it's enough just to kind of to be and to love in the world, or whether they do need something beyond them, which is more fulfilling and sustaining and provides a kind of focus. And another thought, just to sort of add into that, I was thinking for people, well, who've retired, what is the purpose for somebody who's retired? And people who have recently retired, will often struggle with a sense of purpose. Well, what am I supposed to do? Okay, there's only so many rounds of golf I can play in a day, or so many scarves I can knit for the grandchildren. And vice versa, from the other end of the age perspective, do children have a purpose in life? Is purpose actually something that really only applies to those of working age or between 18 and 65 or something? So not particularly coherent set of opening thoughts, Nicola, but maybe something there that you can pick up and chew on and help us to get going.
Yes. a really great beginning, Robert, laying it out for all of us. And we discussed a little bit, as you suggested before we went on air, about the fact that we could expand purpose perhaps to include survival for those who are in incredibly difficult circumstances. They're living in war zones. So for them, purpose is very acute. It's about getting through the next few hours during a bomb raid, getting through that day, getting the basics of survival. So we understand that the sort of more languid approach to purpose is not available to people living in those circumstances. And on the other hand, I would add, if that's all right, into what you've said, is that for those who might be interested in a spiritual discipline, there is the term the soul's purpose. So there is this an idea that there is a way of aligning with the evolution of your soul, and that no matter what you are doing, there is a way of being which is more in alignment with the spiritual path. And there'll be people listening who know even more than we do, which is maybe a little bit not so much, but they will know even more, and maybe perhaps even be scholars in that area. And that also there is this sense that you're describing a little bit like someone feels, and now I'm going to be very mundane, but like the jam. There's a jam jar, and the lid of the jam jar is a little bit loose on the top, that we sort of feel somehow out of alignment with purpose. And we've mentioned things like perhaps living your life purely and solely for personal gain, perhaps pursuing profit and accumulation at any cost, pursuing fame. I mean, these can all be purposes, but I guess the question is whether they deliver ultimate satisfaction over time. Things that may feel purposeful when one is young and establishing oneself, may change in their form later on. And they may become, they're sort of a little bit tarnished over time in terms of what they deliver. And there's a desire, as you said, people often come to Constellations with a sense of wanting what we might term a renewed sense of purpose. So it's a realignment, and it's a more fine-tuning of their inner compass. Oh, I've actually lost sound with you, Robert.
Sorry, I turned my microphone off for a second because of the background noise.
Yeah.
There are a couple of things in what you said there, and it's very rich what you said. Let me pick out just a couple of things, because in a way, what you were talking about towards the end there is the purpose of purpose. Is it there to give us some form of satisfaction or not? Happiness might be the purpose, which purpose is supposed to produce, for example, contentment, peace. So, ironically, purpose might not be an end in itself. It's a direction, it's an indication or a set of signposts, perhaps, in life. And actually, the question of happiness comes up reasonably often in constellations, and I like to remind people that the origin of the idea of happiness, at least, is not what we think of it, as a target to aim at. I must become happy, but rather the reverse, because the word happiness is actually related to the word perhaps and happenstance. It's something which happens by accident. It's the ability to roll with chance and contingency and not be devastated by the change in circumstances around you when the world sort of fails to comply with your expectations of it. So there is that sort of meta question: what is the purpose of purpose? Having said that, I think people who feel that they are serving a purpose feel that they are on track, whether it is helping the poor, working for a charity, bringing up children, mentoring people in the workplace, and so on. They tend to express a sense of satisfaction. And what's interesting about those cases is that I think they all seem to contain an element of altruism. Whereas, of course, as you said, for some people, the purpose of life is to actually make money and be successful. So there are altruistic and non-altruistic purposes. So there's that. which you spoke about, which is a whole area in itself. But you also mentioned the spiritual element, and I'm glad you did. And you talked about the soul. And I'm uh, quite naughty sometimes with people in my workshops, and I'll say, who here believes in the soul or not? And, particularly in the corporate setting, and there's only a smattering of hands that go up. And but if you ask people a question, not do you believe in the soul, but if you ask people a question like, are you living your life in alignment with your soul or not? People almost universally will be able to tell you yes or no, or up to a point, or not as much as I'd like to. So they'll accept the notion of the soul quite readily, actually, when you phrase it like that. And that was something I was reminded of as you were speaking, because in a way, and the phrase higher purpose is one that gets used, isn't it? The notion of a higher purpose as being that which brings us into alignment with the soul, I find very appealing. And I suspect with almost anybody, we could pose this question: what would you have to do in your life in order to be more in alignment with your soul? And immediately they would produce a response. And the response would be along the lines of, well, I'd be doing something more meaningful. I wouldn't be wasting my time doing, tedious admin. I wouldn't be chasing around um, pleasing people at work who don't need to be pleased, and so on. They'd probably be grasping for something uh, of slightly more things that they could be proud of on their deathbed, actually, things that would have a sort of more human resonance for them.
It's
Yeah.
interesting, that, isn't it? That when we get to that level around purpose, there is a sense of somehow connectedness with others, whether it's humans, whether it's animals, whatever your focus is, that a sense of connectedness and offering something, sharing something, giving something, that just having and hoarding is not necessarily of itself satisfying long term. There's something about the sharing, whether it's your time, your thoughtfulness, your energy, that seems to be enlivening. And we associate that with some sort of human purpose or soul purpose at what we might call the higher levels, as opposed to, but actually, of course, people in times of survival are incredibly kind to each other.
Mm. I mean, you mentioned the word sharing, and perhaps that gets us into the territory of constellations and the system and the systemic, because the point of these conversations we're having is that they are about constellations and systemic work. They're not just general themes. And purpose as sharing reminds me, at least, that from a constellations perspective, I think it's a good question to ask people about their purpose in relation to their system. And to put that less cryptically, to ask people, whose purpose are you pursuing? Because the non-systemic assumption is to pursue your purpose is really to pursue your own purpose. Whereas I think you and I have probably seen multiple times cases of individuals who are pursuing a purpose that doesn't really belong to them. It belongs to somebody else. It might be the purpose that a parent has enjoined upon them quite explicitly. I want to be an actor, but dad says you've got to be an engineer or something. And so we are actually pursuing a purpose that isn't ours and is given to us out of a sense of duty. We pursue it. And kind of more profoundly, I suppose, in constellations, we see people who are taking on the purpose, and perhaps at its most vivid, sacrificial purpose. I will give my life up to this cause, that actually comes from somebody in the system who isn't necessarily visible to them. And so the adoption of a purpose can be done at an unconscious, or as we might say, systemic level. So the question, whose purpose are you already following, I think is, it's not a bad one.
Yes, I mean, that's a great thread, Robert. And I think it is allegedly Jung, but I may be wrong, who said the most dangerous thing for children are the unlived dreams of their parents. And perhaps as constellators, we might say the most concerning thing for an individual is the unintegrated pain of their ancestors. Because somehow that, once again, with the new generation, that they orientate their compass a little bit to create scenarios in which those unlived areas of pain are recreated in a modern way, which may or may not be in alignment with their own individual purpose.
Beautifully quotable phrase there, Nicola. That's absolutely fantastic. I mean, I didn't know that Jung quoted if it is Jung, but your take on that as the unintegrated, living the unintegrated pain of the ancestors serves as a kind of ersatz purpose. We end up living that and unconsciously, and the cost of that is multiple, because not only am I then holding that pain, number one. Number two, I'm not pursuing my own purpose. So it's that inherited purpose is blocking me from pursuing my own, because I can't do both at the same time. And number three, the ancestor whose pain it is, or to whom it belongs, themselves remain, even in death, unresting in some way, because they haven't been aligned with that or integrated, reconciled with that pain themselves. So the effect, I think, is kind of threefold in the case you describe.
Yes. And as we say, for people perhaps newer to constellations, unfortunately, so unconsciously compelling.
Yeah, and I absolutely love the way you said that, Nicola. It's the compulsion around it, isn't it? It's the inability to refuse it, or the difficulty in resisting it. In fact, there's this amazing phrase that Freud has in his later work. I think it's in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. He uses this phrase, the compulsion to repeat. And he says this is what the unconscious is, really. I mean, I'm not really a German speaker, but I know the phrase in German is Wiederholen, which means repetition, Zwang. And Zwang means force, but it's a really irresistible force. It's kind of more than compulsion, I think. It's more like a striking. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so powerful, I suppose, about living a purpose that isn't yours. It's not optional in some way. It's a form of necessity.
And it's not arrived at through some kind of inner cognitive discussion with yourself.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, my dad had a hard life, therefore I've got to live a hard life.
Doesn't enter the frame.
Yeah.
So it impacts the individual at a much deeper level. And as you say, when we have these discussions with individuals, they are disconcerted by why they find themselves in this situation, or why they find themselves having repeated a particular relationship or career pattern. And so it can't actually be accessed through imperatives or personal goals. It has to, in a sense, be worked through in the systemic way, the constellations focus, with a deeper ancestral train and thread.
I think you've touched on something really fundamental there in constellations, which is that because we are moderns and the psychology of modernism is really about the individual, most issue holders come to constellations as individuals, thinking, I've got an issue, I need to sort it out. Whereas really, systemically, we're almost thinking of individuals really as manifestations, epiphenomena, to use a fancy word, of a system. They are just one part of a wider system. And I remember that wonderful Merlin Sheldrake book on mushrooms, fungi, which came out, Entangled Life. It came out a few years ago and won a prize. And of course, the word entangled, he will have known through his father and mother. Is connected, is a very strong word in systemic work and constellations and so on. It's I mean, this is a slightly maybe humorous thing to say, but it's as if we're all just mushrooms as part of a mycelium network, and if one person is diseased, it's because the system, you know, as a whole is diseased, and it's really erroneous to think of that single mushroom as a single thing. Um,
And in a microcosm, when you attend a Constellations workshop, I would say, you know, as we might quote, you begin as strangers and you end as compatriots, because there is a sense that you touch something that is deeply human, which is the unresolved pain of all your family systems, but somehow it is shared in that context.
yeah,
The fact that it is shared changes it somehow.
yeah. And I had been wondering recently, I mean, we're straying a bit from the subject of purpose, which I'll try and steer us back to, but I have been wondering recently about, you know, how constellations works, because it obviously we get asked that a lot, don't we? And how does it work? And well, if it can be the case in a family system that people are connected at that underground level to one another, so that, you know, a pain over there is felt over here, why wouldn't we extend that more broadly? So a representative in a constellation is part of that mycelium network with somebody they'd never met. It's just that the connection is a few more degrees removed. But that, in a sense, that's all it is. It is still the system. We're just drawing the boundary of the system a bit wider. And
Yes.
so when you serve as a representative in a constellation, you are getting an experience, a very live experience of what it's like to be a systemic individual, which in a way is a contradiction in terms. We're just picking up in that moment what's already there.
And that was popularized in a networking sense with the term, you know, 6 degrees of separation.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. We're talking about purpose. I think if we widen the avenue of purpose, we could probably fit in everything we've said. But if we were to take it back a bit, it is, as we're agreeing, it is something that is sensed in an individual. And I think it alludes to what you said in the beginning, which I think is incredibly important, is what are the values by which you live? And how would an individual look at the life they have lived in accordance with being in alignment with those values?
Yeah. Yes. That must be true, mustn't it? Because I don't think you could live a purpose that wasn't in alignment with your values. I mean, what would that be?
Well, I think people feel they stray from their values. I think they often say, you know, when I was this age, I wanted to do this or I wanted to do that. Then I got this opportunity. And then often they might say, you know, either they had, you know, financial responsibilities or the money was so good or something happened. And somehow, as you said, they're coming along feeling it's become a bit blunt, and a bit dull, my connection into my purpose and values. I can't feel it anymore.
It's interesting. I mean, we're recording this in September 2024. We're between two elections. We've had one in this country, the United Kingdom. There's obviously a big one coming up in the United States. And as we know, one of the big differences between the two countries is that in the US, the whole administration changes with a new president, whereas in the UK, the civil service remains the same. And the question, I think, always for the civil service in this country or for the civil servant in this country is what happens when I'm serving in an administration whose purpose I don't agree with? You know, I was serving a right wing administration and now serving a left wing administration or vice versa. And there, I think the question of purpose becomes particularly acute, and I think speaks to what you're saying there. You know, what's the degree of tolerance? You know, how far? What's the play between true and off that we can tolerate, that the conscience can tolerate before purpose really feels not just served but actually violated in
Yes.
some way?
Yes, and we know that most people leave if they work for any kind of company, organization, or institution. If they feel a pressure to leave, often it is because they are out of alignment with their direct manager. that somehow their version of work seems to have changed because they have a new person they report to who is leading, and who is leading from their own set of purpose and values, and that's not in alignment with their direct reports. And so they want to move to a different context.
Mm.
So we kind of we do understand this inner compass somehow. And we understand that we can tolerate a little bit of dissonance, as you say, but there comes a point where it becomes intolerable and the cost becomes too high.
Yes, exactly. And that is the point at which it, yes, it can't be sort of sustained or tolerated any longer. Um, I was thinking as you were talking, I mean, the word purpose suggests something over time and into the future that we're heading towards. And maybe, because I was thinking of this Greek word telos, which means an end as well as a purpose. We're here and we're trying to get there. So our purpose is to become, happier, richer, more beautiful, whatever it might be. And maybe because you talked about the soul and spiritual values at the beginning of this conversation, I was wondering, maybe that is an unhelpful way of thinking about it. And one could think about one's purpose, today, on this call with this person in the now rather than in the future. I was looking at YouTube earlier and I get recommendations flashed up to me. And, because of the constellation stuff, I often get Eckhart Tolle flashed up to me. I mean, the algorithm serves me bits of Eckhart. And of course, his most famous book is called The Power of Now. And it got me thinking that actually purpose and immediacy might be bedfellows, that you can have a purpose in the now, which is to be present, have good contact with somebody, not actually try and, get to a certain point. I mean, in this conversation here and now, we have a purpose to record. We're going to get to about 30 minutes, we'll stop. So we have a kind of telos, if you like. But in a way, when we reflect on these conversations, afterwards, we normally have a few minutes debrief. Maybe what's most satisfying about them is the feeling of being in contact with each other in the moment and just seeing where things go. There is an element of just being there and following the digressions a little bit, and that sort of purpose as a kind of tracking the now as it deviates, kind of, which I find quite an appealing idea. Actually,
Yeah. And that's wonderfully put, Robert, because I think the purpose of these recordings is, as I say, to quote that philosopher Cheryl Cole, is to have a journey. It's all life's a journey. So it's about to be present to what unfolds, and a sense of in our attempts to experience presence, something expands.
Yeah.
And so it ironically, it's rather than getting somewhere, it is sort of being somewhere. But there's a sort of somehow kind of we may not be charging ahead, but we may be experiencing something that feels a little bit deeper than, writing our shopping list.
Yeah.
So it is, I absolutely agree with you. I think if you are in your life quite constrained, and many people may be as they're listening to this, they have financial constraints and family constraints, but, the soul is not constrained in that way. And your capacity to occupy, be presence, be taken over by presence is within your capacity.
That's beautiful, Nicola. And I'll hand back to you in a second to wrap up because we're pretty much at time. But I do like that idea of the soul not being constrained, and that actually purpose, it makes me think purpose rather than being a fixed unit can be thought of as an expanding state. Rather than my purpose is to make money, be happy, have children. Actually, purpose isn't necessarily something that is ever complete in that way. It can't be checked off. But can be a process of deepening. What deepens one into one's purpose. And your phrase, again, beautifully quotable phrase, less about getting there and more about being here.
Mm. And so then maybe just to conclude, I would say at the most simplest level, even, today as people finish watching this and get on with their lives, it's not so much what am I doing, but how am I doing it? Because that's the freedom.
Yeah, lovely.
Yes. So thank you to everyone who's been watching and listening to us. Please like, share, or subscribe. That helps keeps us motivated. If you have any special requests or comments, please put them below. And we look forward to speaking and sharing with you on another occasion. You can find Robert on his website, robertrowlandsmith.com, and myself at nicoladunnconstellations.com. Thank you.